that means that we have another issue, Mr. President, which can possibly reach the Supreme Court. Kinailangan pa ba natin na i-zero talaga si PhilHealth to free up 74 billion pesos, Mr. President? I'm reminded of the saying that health is wealth. But I don't think, Mr. President, that we can use funds meant for health so that we will justify this, that we will generate wealth for the nation. Parang hindi makatuwiran yung makatuwiran yung 74.4 billion pesos reduction. Wrong timing pa. Now that kung ano yung itinuturo natin sa PhilHealth, pinipressure natin sila, gagawin na nila. Tapos ngayon parang pipilayan natin sila para magawa nila yung sinasabi natin gawin nila, Mr. President. I think it is our duty, being the minority, to ask some questions, especially about the BICAM report on the national budget, especially after having noticed some significant swings. When we say swing, let's say net changes in some of the budgetary items, Mr. President, reported to us. No? Kasi we are, right before me is a summary of the conference committee report, Mr. President. So with the permission of our chairperson, our chairwoman, if this representation can proceed with these questions, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, I'll gladly take this opportunity.
Mr. President, I'll start with one of the issues that I raised in last year's budget process, or meaning to say, covering the 2024 budget, which is the issue on the level of the unprogrammed appropriations, Mr. President. If I can start with that, Mr. President, if our chairwoman can inform us, all of us, what is now the level of the unprogrammed appropriations under our bicameral conference committee report?
The unprogrammed appropriations is 531,665
million, yes. So that's now the ending of our BICAM report. But then, our NEP, okay, if our chairwoman can find out what was the NEP level of the unprogrammed appropriations, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the NEP level is 158.665 billion.
Yes, Mr. President. So, paki-minus na. 531.
So it's an increase of 373.
Yes, an increase of 373 billion pesos. Unfortunately, Mr. President, this practice of increasing the unprogrammed appropriations in the final version of the national budget over and above the level of the unprogrammed appropriations recommended by the President in the President's budget, or called the NEP, is one of the issues I have raised before the Supreme Court. And we are repeating the said practice in our plan for the 2025 budget. Mas maliit nga kasi for 2024 halos if I'm not mistaken 400 billion yung in-increase ngayon, but it's still 373 billion pesos. So was increase. We're increasing it. So was this issue ever touched in the discussion of our chairwoman with the chair of the House panel, Mr. President?
Mr. President, this was actually discussed with our technical working group. What we have decided is that we have limited resources, but there are so many programs that we would like to fund. And unfortunately, we don't have the immediate amount on hand. So there's still certain projects that will be categorized in the unfunded, unprogrammed appropriations. Ideally, there should be none. And I would concede that. That's why from last year, from this year, 2024, which was 737 billion, now we are at 531 billion. There are obviously a long ways to go when it comes to having more fiscal discipline. But this is the reality, and I'm transparent about this, that we really have unprogrammed appropriations. Last year, if I may mention, what was released for this year is, as of November, from the 737 billion, Mr. President, out of the 731 billion, 438 billion of the unprogrammed funds for 2024 was released. So certain priority projects also that were put in the unprogrammed have been funded already.
So meaning to say, since we have data already for year 2024, for year 2024, we have, the administration has released under the unprogrammed appropriations an amount larger than the original figure in the NEP under unprogrammed appropriations for the year 2024. Tama
No,
po?
Mr. President, for 2024, it's 731 billion.
Correct. Yan po yung sa GAA na
Yeah,
natin.
for
But
the NEP.
For the NEP, that was around, that must have been around 300 billion. Tama po ba?
Yes, Mr. President,
Yes,
281 billion.
281 billion. But now, from actual figures, they have released around 400 billion of the 700 billion in the unprogrammed.
Yes,
Tama.
Mr.
Sige
President.
po. I'm just establishing po that fact, Mr. President. But then, Mr. President, unfortunately, this representation has to be consistent with his stand, Mr. President, and his beliefs, Mr. President. So, that means that we have another issue, Mr. President, which can possibly reach the Supreme Court. Because the Constitution talks about appropriations, that the Congress may not increase the appropriations as recommended by the President. So, very simple lang naman yung yung interpretation ko po. When the word appropriations is used, it does not distinguish between programmed and unprogrammed appropriations.
Well, Mr. President, the unprogrammed is really not part of the total of the BICAM report or the budget proposed. Okay, so it's obviously, that's why it's called unprogrammed, it's unfunded. Now, if you mention about the President has the power to appropriate for the unprogrammed funds based on certain criteria. First of all, it has to come from a source. For example, extra collections from the government, from GOCCs, dividends, extra collections from the BIR, etc., or even loan proceeds, which, as I understand now, even our Secretary of Finance is not really very keen on adding more additional loans because we have to keep our debt to GDP ratio at around 60 to 61%. So this will really come from extra funding that the government is able to collect.
And for the year 2024, there was an extra or an additional mechanism inserted in funding and unprogrammed appropriations. Yun yung sweeping of the so-called idle funds which affected PhilHealth. Sinasabi ko lang yan so that I will also not forget to raise PhilHealth later on. Pero, okay. But Mr. President, yung 400 billion of the items under unprogrammed appropriations na na-release na at na-fund na so far for the year 2024, what was the legal basis for funding them? Isn't it dagaa, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President. That was actually one of the provisions in the GAA, that funding from other sources, government revenue, in excess, can fund unprogrammed appropriations.
Correct. So, meaning to say, kahit si unprogrammed, unprogrammed talaga siya, so hindi siya talaga kasama sa total ni programmed appropriations. But the legal basis, kasi ang general rule sa Constitution natin, no public funds shall be spent except pursuant to an appropriations provided by law. So when those 400 billion items under unprogrammed appropriations were funded, what was the law made as the basis for funding them. Hindi po ba GAA din of 2024?
Yes, Mr.
Correct.
President.
Okay, tama po. Meaning to say, pag sinabing appropriations, kasama si programmed at si unprogrammed. So, Mr. President, with this information, I have no choice but to once again raise this before the Supreme Court. Maybe in a new case or siguro, supplemental ba? Alright, supplemental petition before the Supreme Court, Mr. President.
But, Mr. President, just for clarification, anyway, you're the legal expert here. There's really, all GOCCs remit also to the government, excess funds. And then the GAA, the GAA itself is a law. Now, if these are unprogrammed, I understand that the President also has the power to allocate certain funding options for certain programs. Now, when our minority leader raised this issue with the Supreme Court, I know it was very specific for the PhilHealth funds, which was actually savings that is not really an income-generating matter that has to be automatically appropriated to the government, unlike other agencies that any dividends should be transferred to the government. I know that PhilHealth isn't. So with the clarity given by the Supreme Court, we have that guidance already in mind. That's why we did not specifically put a provision exactly like what we had in 2024.
So our chairwoman is informing us that the fourth trigger or fourth mechanism found in the 2024 GAA as about sweeping idle funds is no longer found in our 2025.
Yes, Mr. President.
Bill. But then, Mr. President, yung petition ko po sa Supreme Court is different. Actually, separate yun. I have actually 4 cases before the Supreme Court, Mr. President. One is questioning the level of the unprogrammed appropriations. Number 2 is the PhilHealth, the order to sweep 89.9 billion pesos of PhilHealth funds. The third would be the Maharlika Corporation. And the fourth would be our intra-party dispute with the party of Senator Robin Padilla, Mr. President. So these are the 4 cases pending before the Supreme Court, Mr. President. So anyway, at any rate, okay, Mr. President, does this mean, since we increased the unprogrammed appropriations level by 373 billion pesos, does this mean that we transferred from programmed appropriations under the President's budget 373 billion pesos worth of line items, and we transferred this to the unprogrammed appropriations part? Is that a correct statement?
Well, Mr. President, yes, partly
Yes,
some
correct.
of them were transferred. But remember, this is also based on a consultation of what the priorities are. Of course, we always have a wish list of projects and also initiatives, but in the end, we also look at the disbursement rate, the utilization rate.
Meaning to say, yung 373 billion pesos na increase sa unprogrammed appropriations, lahat ng idea doon, lahat ng items na yon, yung PAPs ang tawag yan, lahat ng programs, activities, and projects na yon, were originally found in the President's budget but under programmed appropriations. Is that a correct statement?
Mr. President, some of them were not in the original NEP or the President's proposals. Some of them were actually amendments done by institutional amendments done by either houses.
Okay, by Congress. So, does the chairwoman have the anong tawag mo dun? Breakdown, which, okay, how much of the 373 billion pesos now found in unprogrammed originally came from programmed appropriations under the NEP?
Mr. President, may we be able to submit that to Your Honor with regards to the specific, because it's quite lengthy to go back to all of that.
Just the total. The total lang, because, bakit ko to tinatanong? Because that means that is now the fiscal space made available under programmed appropriations. That's my point, Mr. President. Kaya ang next tanong, of this fiscal space, paano napuno yun? Saan din galing yung mga new PAPs na pinampuno doon sa amount na yun? Doon patungo yung pagtatanong ko po, Mr. President.
As an example, Mr. President, the foreign assisted projects in the NEP of 2025 is 215,649. Now, what the BICAM approved is 66,279. So basically, 149,370 is now in the unprogrammed.
Yes, binaba. Okay, so let's say 149. But definitely more than that amount siguro, no? You're just using that as an example.
Yes. There are also others.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the level for programmed appropriations did not change. Tama po ba yun? From the NEP level, programmed appropriations is still now, the BICAM report level for programmed appropriations is the same as the NEP level. Tama?
Yes, Mr.
Correct.
President.
Meaning to say, kung nagbaba tayo ng 149 billion, inalis natin sa President's programmed appropriations, binaba natin, pero the level is now the same. Therefore, in the budgeting process by Congress came up with at least 149 billion new items which they funded under programmed appropriations. Tama po yun?
Yes, Mr.
Correct,
President.
correct. That's why we need to know the level, Mr. President. But anyway, the chairwoman has promised to give us in writing na lang, no? The level. So that is what happened. And then, Mr. President, if I can ask about the miscellaneous personal benefits fund, sa NEP, the President's budget, 163 billion pesos ang level niyan. Sa BICAM report natin, 109 billion pesos. Meaning to say, nag-free up din tayo ng 54 billion pesos. Kasi hindi rin nagbago yung bottom line eh. Bottom line, the same. So, is it correct to say that the 54 billion pesos na inalis natin sa MPBF ay nalagyan din ng new items by Congress? Tama po ba yun?
Yes, Mr. President. Also for the miscellaneous and personal benefits, there are a lot of reasons. There are reasons also for that. For example, although there are items in the proposed NEP, the reality is also certain job positions are not filled. That's why we also looked at the utilization rate, disbursement rate as in the past.
Yes, and we were able to free up, let us say, MPBF line lang ito, 54 billion. Kaya
yes,
nga,
Mr.
then,
President.
since hindi nagbago si bottom line, ibig sabihin nun, nalagay sa ibang mga budget items yon, PAPs, na hindi na nanggaling sa Presidente, nanggaling na po sa Kongreso. Tama po?
Yes,
Tama
Mr.
po,
President.
okay. And then, pagdating sa pension and gratuity fund, sa President's budget, 232 billion ang level nito. Ang ending sa ating BICAM report, 144 billion. So, ano to, mga 88 billion pesos din po yung na-free up natin. Tama po? So, ang gusto sabihin, ang dami na natin na-free up. So,
Mr. President, it's true that compared to the NEP, there may have been a decrease, but bearing in mind also that compared to 2024, there's been an increase. And we know that for a fact that the increase can cover the current needs for personal benefits and pensions.
yes, Mr. President. Pero yun lang, I'm just looking up, I'm just pointing out the fiscal space that Congress has freed up under programmed appropriations. Yun po, that's what I'm pointing out. And bago malimutan, we also freed up 74 billion pesos, 74.4 billion pesos sa PhilHealth subsidy. Tama po yun? Which is under programmed appropriations. Tama po?
Yes, Mr. President.
Why did we have to do that, Mr. President? Sa dami na ng hindi pa tayo makakame up ng total amount of the fiscal space which we have freed up sa programmed appropriations because hindi natin alam yung how much of the 373 billion of new items under unprogrammed appropriations came from program. Hindi pa natin alam eh. But we will add to that the MPBF, we add to that the PGF na mga freed amounts plus the 74 of the PhilHealth. Kinailangan pa ba natin na i-zero talaga si PhilHealth to free up 74 billion pesos, Mr. President?
I know, Mr. President, that's also the question of many. And I've thought about this long and hard. And there's no denying that PhilHealth has a savings amount of 600 billion, Mr. President. And that's also the reason why initially the administration thought of it as a way also to augment certain short fundings that we had, for example, for health workers, etc. Hindi natin maintindihan ba't hindi nila ginagamit yung pera na nandun na meron sila na nakaimbak sa isang, ewan ko kung anong klaseng account yan, savings account, na ang kinikita ay mas mababa pa kesa sa inflation. Mr. President, hindi pwedeng sisihin na nagkulang tayo sa pagbibigay sa kanila. Kasi nga ang daming ang pera na nandyan. Hindi nila pinamimigay ang pera dun sa mga nangangailangan at tinuturuan din natin sila ng leksyon. Kung bigay ka ng bigay, nandun lang yung pera, hindi naman nagagamit. Paano naman yung mga ibang programa rin ng gobyerno na nangangailangan din ng funding? Yun nga yung sinasabi ko, pag meron kang, syempre, di ba, sinasabi natin, 5 yung anak mo, lahat yan, kailangan pantay-pantay na mabigyan mo. Totoo yun. Pero sa lahat sa kanila, tinitignan mo rin kung sino may pangangailangan at sino naman ang may kakayanan na itayo rin ang kanyang sarili. Yun din ang sinasabi natin, it's a leadership problem also in PhilHealth and it's a disbursement problem. Gaya nga ng sinabi ni Senator Cynthia, ang problema din sa PhilHealth, hindi na natin alam kung ano ba talaga yung mga benepisyo natin. Wala tayong card na nagsasabi hanggang dito o ganyan ang maibibigay sa'yo, ang tagal-tagal ng approval minsan, hindi alam ng mga ating mga kababayan kung paano sila makapag-comply dun sa mga requirements. So ito yung mga nagiging issue. Hindi sila kulang sa pera. At alam ko yung iba talagang pinagdidiinan nito. Pero 600 billion ang meron sila. Samantalang, ang dami natin din pangangailangan pagdating sa edukasyon, pagdating sa infrastruktura. Alam mo, maganda talagang magbigay ng social protection, wealth transfer. Importante yan. Pero kailangan din natin ng wealth-generating initiatives kasi hindi natin mapopondohan ang mga ibang bagay na magbibigay ng suporta sa ating mga kababayan kung ang gobyerno ay walang programa na magpapalago ng ating ekonomiya.
I'm reminded of the saying that health is wealth. But I don't think, Mr. President, that we can use funds meant for health so that we will justify that we will generate wealth for the nation.
Mr. President,
so,
the budget of the DOH has increased from last year. So it may not have been an item, for example, in particular for PhilHealth. Pero, meron naman pong increase na nangyari dito sa DOH from 241 billion 602 in 2024, yung BICAM natin nasa 247,923. So we are, of course, health is wealth. That's very important. But also, health, the financial situation of our country, the economy, and wealth-generating initiatives are important so that we can support social protection initiatives such as the health sector.
Sige, mag-digress po tayo muna sa health sector. Pero napansin ko po na ang ating final amount sa Department of Health is 247.9 billion pesos sa BICAM report. Mas mababa by 25.7 billion pesos from the GAB. 273.7 billion pesos. So, binawasan pa rin natin ang DOH. And then, ang ating ang ating pampalubag-loob lang ay yung level, nung binawasan na, yung ending amount is still higher than the 2024 GAE amount.
Yes, Mr. President.
But why did we reduce it, Mr. President, by 25.7 billion pesos, which is a very significant amount also, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, there are certain agencies that we also supported. Like, for example, the Department of Agrarian Reform, we had given them an increase for their budget. We also had given the state universities and colleges an increase in their budget. The DICT, we've also given them an increase. The Department of National Defense also has an increase. So, Mr. President, if possible, we would like to increase all. But then also because of the substantial budget allocation of other departments, we also made sure that departments that are also crucial have a respectable amount that they can operate with.
So, pwede ba nating masabi na itong 74.4 billion pesos ng PhilHealth na ziniro natin ay binigay sa ibang mga ahensya ng gobyerno na sa tingin natin ng ating committee na mas nangangailangan o mas deserving ng amount, at masasabi ba natin na hindi directly health-related yung napuntahan ng 74.4 billion pesos na yon, Mr. President?
Mr. President, hindi sa masasabi nating more deserving, more in need, perhaps.
Yes.
And then also, yes, I think I know where your next question will lead to. But yes, I think transparently you can look that if you look at the increase in some appropriations, they're not health-related.
Yes, they're not health-related. Ngayon, Mr. President, ang problema kasi yung timing din ng pagbaba natin eh. We want to teach them a lesson, pero 74.4 billion pesos tatanggalin natin, isi-zero natin. Pero hindi ba natin alam na pinasa natin dito sa chamber natin yung panukala na pababain ng premium rates. Nababa natin eh. At the same time, inutusan natin sila to increase their compensation packages, which ginawa nila. Tapos hindi lang dagdagan pa, may konsulta, etc. So, ang nangyayari po, Mr. President, we are being conservative with PhilHealth by reducing the subsidy by 74.4 billion pesos at a time when PhilHealth has now committed to be more proactive, aggressive, and then we are returning some benefits to the direct contributors by lowering the contribution rate, Mr. President. Ganyan ang nangyari. So, parang hindi makatwiran yung makatwiran yung 74.4 billion pesos reduction, wrong timing pa. Now that kung ano yung itinuturo natin sa PhilHealth, pinipressure natin sila, gagawin na nila, tapos ngayon parang pipilayan natin sila para magawa nila yung sinasabi natin gawin nila, Mr. President.
Mr. President, unang-una, hindi ako naniniwala na mapipilayan sila. Kasi nga may pagkukunan pa rin silang 600 bilyon. So sabihin na natin, 70 billion ang hindi na nalaan sa kanila ngayon sa budget. Meron naman silang pagkukunan na 600 bilyon. Ngayon, sa susunod na taon, kung talagang tinupad nila ang kanilang pangako na number 1, mas iigihan nila ang pagbigay ng suporta sa mga may sakit na nangangailangan. Pangalawa, na-implement na yung batas. Ewan ko kung napasa na ba yung batas na yon na bababaan yung premium at hindi na dapat kasama sa batas yung pag-increase ng premium na yon. At saka natin masasabi na, sige, sa susunod na taon, 2026 budget, pwede na nating punuan muli sapagkat nagagamit na nila yung kanilang reserba.
Nakalimutan ko nga i-mention na pinush ko nga sila na magkaroon ng dental services at ngayon nababasa natin that they are also offering dental services, Mr. President.
Exactly, Mr.
to be
President. I
covered.
think this can be evaluated. For example, you have a child who has committed something, you're teaching your child a lesson, hindi naman porket na nag-reform na kaagad, ay ibibigay mo na muli. Kailangan mo nang patunayan rin na masusustain ito. Magagawa niya talaga ng tuloy-tuloy. Kaya nga, dito, uulitin ko at alam ko marami rin ng magtataka dito, no? Pero 600 billion, may pera kang ganon. May mga ibang programa ng gobyerno na pwede ring pondohan at hindi naman maghihirap ang PhilHealth dahil meron silang pagkukunan para bayaran. Ang problema nga nila noon, hindi nila ginagawa yon. Kaya ngayon, salamat sa inisyatibo nga, sinabi nga natin, yung ating minority leader, sinabi, dapat meron kayong dental benefits o gagawin daw nila o ginagawa na nila. O ngayon, may batas pero hindi ko alam, parang hindi pa yata napapasa na hindi muna itataas ang premium, di ba? Hindi pa yan batas. Di ba? Iamyanda pa lang natin yan. Hindi pa yan nangyayari. So sa ngayon, ang daming nagrereklamo na ang taas ng premium ng PhilHealth tumataas, pero ang benepisyo nila, hindi pa rin ganun. Kaya meron pa rin silang nakokolektang premium na mas mataas.
Ang ating problema sa PhilHealth subsidy kasi, Mr. President, is yung formula is provided by law. Yan po, that is the long and short of it. Ngayon, by giving zero subsidy, are we in effect saying that we are suspending that the provisions in the Universal Healthcare Act and the syntax law? So thank you for correcting me. In the syntax law, which provides for that formula, which we discussed during we discussed, I think, during the budget deliberations. We mentioned the formula. So is that what we're doing? Number one, kasi when you give a government agency zero budget, talagang number one ang message dun punishment mo yan. Okay. And then but number two, merong rito na there is a formula, and the formula yields I think around 74.4 billion pesos ang paggamitin yung formula. Hindi pala 73, I will correct myself. 53.13 billion pesos ang may-yield ng formula, Mr. President, around that amount. So, is it also our message that we are suspending the formula found under the syntax law?
Mr. President, we are not suspending the implementation of a law. What we are saying is that at the moment, it is an unfunded program or law of the government. You know, we have more than 1 trillion pesos of unfunded laws in the country. Maraming mga batas pero nagkukulang ang pondo para dito. Ngayon, the GAA in itself is also a law. I understand the Senate minority leaders mentioned, but this is earmarked. Earmarked ito, so dapat doon talaga napupunta. Pero yung BIR, for example, has also that earmark na they are able to harness or benefit from 1% of their total collections. But because they haven't really reached a certain utilization, the government has not given them that 1% supposedly that would go to them. So, Mr. President, this is not, sadly, the reality is this is not uncommon. And the GAA itself is a law. We have a discretion also to look at the macro picture of a particular time in our society and economy and to see what fiscal space we have.
Thank you for that, Mr. President. But unfortunately, I think when we apply the formula for what is to be remitted to PhilHealth under the UHCA, this is based on actual revenues or collections. So wala pong reason na masabi natin it will be an unfunded mandate kasi if the collection is zero, percentage of zero is zero, pero may collection So we have to, if the sponsor will allow me to read para the provisions. No? Ano ba dapat ang binibigay sa PhilHealth? Utos ng Universal Healthcare Act. Revenues from excise tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. 50% of total revenue shall be allocated, may word pa na exclusively, to PhilHealth. 80% nito. 80% of the 50%. Tama? to PhilHealth. Okay. Revenues from excise tax on alcohol products. 50% of total revenue shall be allocated exclusively to PhilHealth, to the tune of 80% of that 50%. Revenues from excise tax on tobacco products. 50% of total excise tax collection from tobacco products shall be exclusively allocated to PhilHealth to the tune of 80% of that 50%. And then revenues from excise tax on heated tobacco products and vapor products, from the total revenues, PhilHealth must be given 80% for the implementation of the Universal Healthcare Act. And then, sa pagkakaintindi ko, ito na yon. That is why umabot tayo sa 74.43 billion sa NEP, because health insurance coverage under sin tax law amounting to 53.13 billion pesos to be used for health insurance premiums of indirect contributors. Plus, inad doon yung 21.17 billion pesos benefit package improvement under the Universal Healthcare Law, plus a smaller amount of 127.5 million pesos special purpose insurance, million lang po yun, 127.5 million pesos special purpose insurance coverage for the health insurance premiums of the beneficiaries under Pamana program. Pag isuma total lahat yun yung 74.43 billion pesos na nasa NEP as subsidy to PhilHealth. Pero meron pa nagdi-dispute na hindi yung tama, di ba? Although I must hasten to add na meron pa nga nagdi-dispute dyan that if you properly apply the formula, it should even be a bigger amount than the 74.43 billion pesos. That's the point, Mr. President. And then na-zero na natin. And then, admittedly, ang destinasyon nung na-free up na 74.4 billion pesos, aminado tayong hindi sa directly health purposes, Mr. President. So that's what happened to PhilHealth, Mr. President. So, it's a different, this is my opinion, Mr. President. The subsidy for PhilHealth is in the nature of is like an automatic appropriation because the law provides for the formula. Parang ministerial act na lang sa DBM to determine the amount under the formula and then give it as a subsidy. Minimum amount of subsidy kasi itong mga benefit packages, dagdag na po yan. Pero minimum amount of subsidy is determined by law. So when we are discussing general principles ng budget, when they mention automatic appropriations, ang instruction nila sa Congress, you cannot touch automatic appropriations because the appropriation is provided by law. So that's the point of this representation, Mr. President.
Mr. President, if I may, there are also
Umani naman ito ng iba't ibang reaksyon mula sa ating mga netizens. Ayon kay Sandy Marichua, turuan din namin kayo ng leksyon sa darating na eleksyon. Pahayag naman ni Hadia Aliyah, kawawa naman yung nagbabayad ng PhilHealth, kapal ng pagmumukha ng mga ito. At ito naman ang saloobin mula sa ating kababayan na si Chen Netcourse, isang senadora na walang malasakit sa mga mahihirap. Mga kababayan, feel free to comment below para maglabas ng saloobin sa balitang ito.